If you think graduation is the beginning of freedom, you've never heard silence louder than this. On a warm June afternoon in Boston, Ethan Walker stood among hundreds of graduates inside a packed university hall, the air thick with celebration, applause rolling like waves across the auditorium, yet none of it seemed to reach him in the same way. He adjusted the hem of his gown, glanced toward the stands, and found his father, Robert Walker, sitting perfectly still, not clapping, not smiling, just watching with a kind of distant focus that made Ethan's chest tighten without knowing exactly why. When the ceremony ended and families poured onto the floor in joyful chaos, Ethan expected at least a handshake, maybe a brief nod of pride, something small but human. Yet Robert Walker walked straight toward him with measured steps, stopping just close enough for the noise around them to fade into background blur. And in that moment, he said the words that would quietly split Ethan's life into before and after. "Expect no help from me." There was no anger in his voice, no hesitation, just finality, like a decision already filed away long before this day ever arrived. Ethan blinked, searching Robert's face for some hidden meaning, some sign that this was a test or a misunderstanding. But there was nothing to decode, only certainty. Around them, graduates were hugging their families, tossing caps into the air, taking photos that would be framed for decades, while Ethan stood frozen in a space that suddenly felt too wide and too empty. He tried to respond, to ask what that meant, but the words didn't form, as if his own voice had been placed on pause. Robert adjusted his watch, glanced briefly at the crowd as if he had somewhere else to be, and added in a lower tone that carried even more weight than the first line. "Don't expect my name to open doors for you either. Whatever comes next, you do it on your own." Then he turned slightly, already disengaging, already stepping out of the emotional frame of the moment, as if it had no further relevance to him. Ethan watched him go, feeling something shift in his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his future. Because this wasn't just a lack of support, it was a removal of safety itself, a quiet declaration that whatever path lay ahead would not include a safety net of any kind. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Ethan remained standing near the edge of the hall, holding his diploma like an object that suddenly weighed more than paper should, watching other families move past him with laughter and photos and plans for dinner celebrations, while he realized he had none of that waiting. The world outside the building was bright, almost aggressively normal, cars passing, people talking, life continuing as if nothing significant had changed. But for Ethan, something irreversible had already happened inside those walls. He took a slow breath, not because he was calm, but because he had to remind himself he still could. And as he stepped down the university steps alone, he didn't know yet that this was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a version of it where every success would have to be built without permission, without approval, and without anyone ever saying it was expected. The first weeks after leaving the university felt like stepping into a world that had not been waiting for Ethan Walker at all. Boston moved forward with its usual rhythm, early morning commuters rushing through subway stations, coffee shops filling with the smell of roasted beans and urgency, office towers reflecting a skyline that seemed indifferent to individual stories. Ethan rented a small studio apartment on the edge of the city, nothing more than a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out onto a narrow street where delivery trucks passed more often than people stopped. He spent his days applying for entry-level finance roles, sending out resumes that were either ignored or answered with polite rejections that felt the same after a while. One evening, as he sat at his desk scrolling through another rejection email, he noticed how quiet the room had become, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that makes time feel heavier than it should. He did not tell anyone about how often he checked his phone hoping for something different, and he did not mention his father, Robert Walker, whose words still echoed in the back of his mind like a fixed point he could not move away from. It was during one of those late nights, when the city outside had softened into a blur of distant headlights, that Ethan received a message from a recruiter he had never heard of before. The message was brief, almost casual, asking if he would be open to a short conversation regarding a financial analysis position at a small private company. There was no prestige attached to it, no well-known name, nothing that would have made it stand out on paper, but something in Ethan made him respond anyway. The next morning, he found himself sitting in a modest office building in downtown Boston, far from the glass towers he had imagined working in, facing a man named Daniel Reed, who observed him with a calm attention that felt different from every interview he had experienced before. Daniel did not ask about connections or family background, and he did not seem interested in where Ethan had come from, only in how he thought. He presented him with a series of financial scenarios, asking him to analyze risk structures, cash flow patterns, and market behavior under pressure. And for the first time since graduation, Ethan felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with fear or doubt, but with clarity. He spoke slowly at first, then with more certainty as the patterns began to reveal themselves in his mind, and Daniel simply listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, as if confirming something he already suspected. At the end of the meeting, Daniel closed the folder in front of him and said that the company he was involved with was small, unstable, and in need of someone who could see through complexity rather than follow instructions. Then asked Ethan if he would consider working on a temporary financial restructuring project that most people would have avoided. Ethan hesitated only briefly, not because he lacked interest, but because he understood for the first time that this opportunity carried no guarantee of success, no safety net, and no one to fall back on if it failed. Yet something about that absence of certainty felt familiar in a way he could not fully explain, and after a long pause, he agreed. Outside the building, the air felt colder than he expected for early autumn, and as he walked back toward the train station, he realized that for the first time since leaving the university steps alone, he was not just moving forward without support. He was stepping into something unknown that might either confirm everything he had been told about himself or quietly begin to prove it wrong. The project Ethan Walker accepted was not impressive on paper, and that was exactly why most people would have ignored it. The company was a small financial technology startup operating out of a shared office space in downtown Boston, the kind of place where the elevators moved slowly and the hallway lights buzzed faintly during late hours. When Ethan arrived on his first official day, he expected to be given instructions, structure, and limitations, but instead he was handed a set of disorganized financial reports, fragmented investor notes, and outdated projections that seemed to contradict each other at every turn. Daniel Reed, the man who had brought him in, simply told him that the company was losing control of its financial clarity and needed someone who could rebuild understanding from the ground up. There was no mention of titles, no discussion of hierarchy, only a quiet expectation that Ethan would either see what others could not or quietly step aside. In the first 48 hours, Ethan barely slept. He spread documents across his small desk in the office, cross-referencing revenue streams, analyzing burn rates, and reconstructing cash flow models that had been assembled incorrectly for months. The numbers did not make sense at first, and there were moments when even the basic assumptions of the business seemed unstable. But instead of stepping away, Ethan began to notice patterns that were hidden beneath the noise. Revenue spikes that had been misattributed, operational costs that were duplicated in reporting systems, and investor projections that were built on overly optimistic assumptions rather than grounded data. Each discovery did not bring excitement at first, only a deeper awareness of how fragile the structure really was. Daniel would occasionally stop by his desk late in the evening, not to ask for updates, but to observe in silence for a few moments before leaving without interruption, as if measuring whether Ethan was simply working harder or thinking differently. On the third night, long after most of the office had gone dark, Ethan found himself staring at a single consolidated model he had built from scratch, one that revealed a path the company had never considered before. It was not a path of rapid expansion or aggressive investment, but a restructuring of financial priorities that stabilized cash flow while eliminating unnecessary risk exposure. When Daniel finally reviewed the model the next morning, he did not react immediately. He read through it slowly, line by line, as if confirming that what he was seeing was not accidental. Then he asked Ethan to explain how long it had taken him to see the structure that others had missed for months. Ethan simply answered that it was not about time, but about removing assumptions that no longer matched reality. That answer seemed to stay with Daniel longer than anything else said in the meeting. Within a week, Ethan was no longer just analyzing data, but actively reshaping how the company understood its own financial identity. Departments that had been operating in isolation were now being connected through a unified reporting system that he designed. Decisions that had once been made based on intuition were slowly being replaced with models grounded in measurable outcomes. Yet, even as progress began to appear, Ethan never felt a sense of arrival, only the quiet pressure of responsibility growing heavier with each passing day. He often returned home late at night, walking through Boston streets that were empty except for the occasional passing car, thinking not about success, but about how quickly stability could disappear if even one assumption proved wrong. And somewhere in those long hours of work and silence, without anyone announcing it, the company began to change direction in a way that no one outside that small office could yet fully see, but would eventually become impossible to ignore. By the time Ethan Walker had been with the company for several weeks, the small office in downtown Boston no longer felt unfamiliar, but it still did not feel stable either. The atmosphere remained tense in a quiet way, as if everyone understood they were working on something fragile that could either grow or collapse, depending on decisions made in silence. Ethan had become a constant presence at his desk, often arriving before sunrise and leaving long after the last lights in neighboring offices had gone dark. The financial restructuring model he had built was now being used as the foundation for most internal decisions. But with that influence came a growing awareness that every adjustment he made affected more than just numbers on a screen. Daniel Reed continued to observe without interference, occasionally asking brief questions that forced Ethan to explain not just what he had changed, but why he believed those changes reflected reality more accurately than the previous assumptions. Over time, Ethan noticed that Daniel was not testing his intelligence, but his consistency under pressure. One afternoon, during a meeting that included several senior team members, Ethan was asked to explain a sudden improvement in operational efficiency that had appeared in the latest internal report. Instead of presenting it as a success, he explained the underlying correction that had caused it, pointing out that the improvement was not growth but the removal of previously hidden inefficiencies. The room went quiet after he finished speaking, not out of disagreement, but because the explanation shifted how people understood what progress actually meant. After the meeting, Daniel asked him to stay behind for a few minutes. In the empty conference room, Daniel placed a folder on the table containing preliminary discussions about external funding interest. He explained that what Ethan had been building was beginning to attract attention beyond the company, not because of hype or speculation, but because the financial structure itself was becoming unusually stable under conditions that typically produced volatility. Ethan looked through the documents without speaking at first, noticing names of investment groups and early-stage venture partners he had only seen in case studies before. Daniel then said that if the company continued on its current path, it would need to consider scaling in a way that would require public market readiness within a relatively short time frame. The words did not sound dramatic when he said them, but they carried a weight that Ethan understood immediately. That evening, Ethan stayed later than usual, reviewing updated projections that now included scenarios for rapid expansion. The numbers were no longer just about survival, but about acceleration, and that shift introduced a new kind of pressure that was harder to define than earlier uncertainty. Walking home through Boston that night, he noticed how the city felt different again, not because it had changed, but because his perception of it had. Buildings that once seemed distant now felt connected to decisions being made in his office, and the idea that his work could influence outcomes beyond a single company began to settle into his thinking in a way that was both exciting and unsettling. At the same time, he rarely allowed himself to think about his personal history, especially the last conversation he had with his father, Robert Walker, because that memory did not feel relevant to the work in front of him, yet it remained present in a way he could not fully ignore. What Ethan did not realize yet was that the quiet restructuring he had been building inside a small office was slowly positioning the company for something far larger than internal recovery, and that the next phase would bring attention from places that measured success in terms he had not yet fully experienced. The first real shift in momentum came quietly, without announcement or celebration, but Ethan Walker could feel it the moment he opened his inbox that morning. The financial reports he had been refining for weeks were no longer just internal documents, but had been requested in a structured review by an external advisory group connected to early-stage institutional investors. The email did not contain excitement or praise, only a formal request for deeper analysis of the companies. financial architecture, and projected scalability under current restructuring conditions. Ethan read it twice before responding, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that attention from this level of oversight meant the company had crossed an invisible threshold. Inside the office, Daniel Reed appeared less surprised than expected when Ethan showed him the message. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and asked a simple question about whether the models Ethan had built could withstand pressure testing under aggressive growth assumptions. Ethan answered carefully, explaining that the structure was designed not to maximize short-term expansion, but to maintain stability even when external variables shifted unpredictably. Daniel listened, then said that stability under uncertainty was exactly what larger investors looked for when preparing companies for public markets. Over the following days, the pace inside the office changed. Meetings became longer, discussions more precise, and decisions began to carry implications that extended beyond immediate operational needs. Ethan found himself working not only on refining financial systems, but also on translating those systems into language that external stakeholders could understand without losing the underlying complexity. It was during one of these late evenings that Daniel introduced the concept of formal public offering readiness, explaining that while the company was still small, its internal structure was now behaving like something significantly larger. The idea of an initial public offering had previously felt distant, almost theoretical, but hearing it spoken in a practical context changed its weight entirely. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he reviewed the latest projections, noticing how small adjustments and assumptions could lead to dramatically different outcomes when scaled over time. The realization was not about success, but about responsibility, because every decision now carried potential consequences far beyond the walls of the office. Outside, Boston continued its usual rhythm, but Ethan began to notice how disconnected his internal world had become from the external one. While people around him were focused on daily routines, he was now thinking in terms of systems, valuations, and long-term structural impact. One evening, as he left the office after nearly 12 hours of continuous analysis, Daniel walked with him to the elevator and mentioned that the company's financial profile had recently been reviewed again by outside parties with serious interest in acquisition-level positioning. The words were delivered casually, but Ethan understood their significance immediately. It meant that what he had built was no longer just stabilizing a fragile company, but potentially transforming it into a market-relevant entity. As the elevator descended, Ethan stared at the shifting floor numbers, realizing that the path he was on no longer resembled anything he had imagined at graduation. The uncertainty had not disappeared, but it had evolved into something larger, something tied to scale rather than survival. And somewhere beneath all of this progress, the memory of his father's words still existed, not as a distraction, but as a quiet reminder of where this entire journey had begun, even if the destination was now far beyond what anyone in that graduation hall could have predicted. The transition from internal success to external recognition did not arrive as a single moment, but rather as a gradual accumulation of attention that Ethan Walker only fully understood in hindsight. The company's financial systems, once considered unstable and fragmented, were now being referenced in external discussions as unusually resilient under stress conditions. Ethan noticed that more and more of his time was being spent preparing explanations for people outside the organization who were trying to understand how a small team in Boston had managed to create such consistent structural clarity in its financial model. Daniel Reed handled most of the communication with outside advisors, but he often brought Ethan into meetings where technical explanations were required, especially when investors questioned how the company could scale without losing its internal balance. During one of these sessions, an external analyst asked Ethan directly whether the current model could support expansion into a public market environment within a defined time frame. Ethan responded carefully, explaining that the system was not designed around speculation or rapid acceleration, but around adaptability, allowing it to remain stable even when variables changed unexpectedly. The answer seemed to resonate more than expected, and after the meeting, Daniel mentioned that conversations were beginning to shift from curiosity to structured evaluation. This shift introduced a new layer of complexity into Ethan's work. He was no longer only refining internal systems, but but also preparing documentation that could withstand institutional scrutiny, where every assumption needed to be justified and every projection required evidence. The workload increased significantly, but what changed more noticeably was the level of expectation surrounding his role. He was no longer viewed as someone improving a system, but as someone responsible for defining how that system could exist at scale. Late one evening, while reviewing updated financial forecasts that now extended into multi-year projections, Ethan paused when he noticed how frequently the term initial public offering appeared in the strategic documentation. It was no longer a distant concept or speculative idea, but a structured possibility being discussed in concrete terms. Daniel entered the room shortly after, placing a set of revised investor summaries on the desk and explaining that external interest had reached a point where formal readiness assessments were being prepared. He did not frame it as pressure, but as natural progression based on the company's current trajectory. Ethan listened without interrupting, absorbing the implication that what had begun as a restructuring exercise was now being viewed as a potential public market candidate. Outside the office, Boston had shifted into early winter, and the colder air made the city feel more distant during Ethan's late-night walks home. He often found himself thinking about how quickly the scale of his work had changed, from correcting internal inefficiencies to influencing discussions involving institutional capital and long-term valuation models. Yet despite the growing complexity, there was a consistent focus in his thinking that remained unchanged, which was the need to ensure that every projection remained grounded in realistic assumptions rather than optimistic interpretation. One afternoon, Daniel informed him that a preliminary readiness report had been requested by an external financial advisory group evaluating the company's long-term viability as a public entity. The announcement was made calmly, but Ethan understood that it represented a significant turning point. It meant the company was now being evaluated not only for what it was, but for what it could become under public market expectations. That evening, as Ethan reviewed the updated models once again, he realized that the systems he had built were no longer just tools for internal stability, but frameworks that could define how external observers understood the company's entire identity. And in that realization, the distance between his current work and the moment he had stood alone outside the graduation hall years earlier felt both enormous and unexpectedly connected, as if every step since then had been leading toward a structure he had not yet fully seen until now. The announcement that changed the direction of everything did not arrive with celebration, but with the quiet seriousness of a scheduled meeting that Ethan Walker had been preparing for without fully realizing its final purpose. The external advisory group had completed its preliminary review, and the results had exceeded expectations not in a dramatic way, but in a structured confirmation that the company's financial architecture was stable enough to support public market readiness discussions. Ethan sat in the conference room with Daniel Reed as multiple senior advisors joined through a video call, each one reviewing segments of the report that Ethan had spent months refining and correcting. The discussion moved slowly, focusing on scalability, risk exposure, and long-term valuation stability. When the topic of an initial public offering was formally introduced as a viable next step rather than a theoretical possibility, Ethan felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room. It was not excitement that defined the moment, but recognition, as if a long-developing pattern had finally become visible to everyone at the same time. One of the advisors asked Ethan to explain how the system could maintain stability under sudden market pressure without collapsing into volatility. Ethan responded by outlining the principle he had used from the beginning, which was not to optimize for maximum growth, but to design for structural resilience under unpredictable conditions. The explanation was met with quiet acknowledgement, and after several more minutes of technical discussion, the meeting concluded with the advisory group agreeing to proceed with formal preparation for public offering readiness evaluation. After the call ended, Daniel remained seated for a moment, looking at the screen that had just gone dark, before turning to Ethan and stating that what had started as a small internal restructuring had now reached a stage where external markets were actively measuring its potential impact. The words were delivered without exaggeration, but they carried the weight of confirmation. In the following weeks, the office environment shifted again, this time with a more defined sense of direction. Teams that had previously focused on internal optimization began working alongside external consultants who specialized in public market transitions. Ethan found himself increasingly involved in translating the core financial model into frameworks that could be understood by institutional investors without losing the integrity of the underlying structure. Each revision required careful balance, ensuring that simplification did not become distortion. Despite the growing complexity, Ethan remained consistent in his approach, often reminding himself that the system only worked if it remained truthful to the conditions it was built on. One evening, Daniel called him into a private meeting and informed him that a formal valuation analysis was being prepared based on the current trajectory of the company's performance metrics. The analysis would determine not only potential market positioning, but also investor confidence levels in the upcoming stages of evaluation. Ethan listened as Daniel explained that several external firms had already expressed interest in participating in early-stage offerings if the process moved forward. The information did not create visible excitement in Ethan, but it deepened his awareness of how far the system had evolved from its original fragile state. Later that night, as Ethan walked through the quiet streets of Boston, he reflected on how the meaning of his work had transformed over time. What began as a response to instability had become a framework for expansion, and what once felt like isolated problem-solving had turned into something that could influence large-scale financial perception. Yet despite this transformation, Ethan did not feel detached from where it had started. Instead, he found himself remembering the moment outside the graduation hall, when everything ahead of him had been uncertain and unsupported, and realizing that every decision since then had been shaping a path he could not have fully predicted, but now could no longer deny was leading towards something far larger than anything he had been prepared to imagine at the beginning. The call came on a quiet morning when Ethan Walker was already deep into reviewing the latest round of valuation adjustments that had been prepared for external presentation. Daniel Reed asked him to join a conference room immediately, where the atmosphere felt different from previous meetings, not because of tension, but because of anticipation that had been building over weeks without being openly acknowledged. On the screen, representatives from multiple institutional advisory firms were present, along with legal and financial consultants who had been guiding the company through its public readiness process. The lead advisor began by confirming that the company had passed all preliminary structural evaluations and was now entering the final phase of formal preparation for public offering consideration. The words were delivered with professional precision, but their meaning was unmistakable. Ethan listened carefully as they outlined the next steps, which included finalizing compliance frameworks, refining financial disclosures, and preparing the company's internal systems for external market transparency requirements. When asked to present a summary of the financial architecture he had built, Ethan explained how the system was designed to maintain stability under fluctuating conditions by prioritizing structural accuracy over aggressive expansion assumptions. He described how every component of the model was intentionally constructed to avoid dependency on short-term volatility, allowing the company to remain consistent even when external pressures increased. The advisors responded with measured approval, noting that such design principles were rare in companies at this stage of growth and often indicative of long-term viability in public markets. After the meeting concluded, Daniel remained in the room with Ethan, looking at the finalized documents displayed on the table. He stated that the company was no longer operating as a small internal restructuring case, but as a candidate for public market entry that could attract significant institutional attention once officially listed. The statement did not feel like a promotion or announcement, but rather a confirmation of a trajectory that had already been unfolding. In the days that followed, the pace of work intensified again, but in a more structured and intentional way. External consultants worked closely with Ethan to ensure that every aspect of the financial model could be translated into regulatory language without losing its underlying logic. This process required Ethan to revisit earlier assumptions and validate them under stricter analytical frameworks, ensuring that the system could withstand scrutiny from multiple independent evaluations. Despite the increasing complexity, Ethan remained focused on maintaining consistency, often spending long hours refining projections and adjusting models to reflect more conservative but realistic outcomes. One afternoon, Daniel informed him that preliminary investor interest reports indicated strong confidence from several major financial groups, all of whom were closely monitoring the company's readiness timeline. The information suggested that once the public offering process was officially initiated, demand could exceed initial expectations based on early valuation estimates. Ethan acknowledged the update without visible reaction, but internally he understood that the scale of what he had built had reached a point where external perception was beginning to form independently of internal control. Later that evening, as he walked through the familiar streets of Boston, the city felt quieter than usual despite the steady flow of traffic and light activity around him. His thoughts returned briefly to the earlier stages of the journey, when the work had been purely about survival and problem-solving within a small office environment. Now, the same systems he had built under uncertainty were being evaluated as potential frameworks for public market integration, and the distance between those two realities felt both vast and continuous at the same time. And somewhere within that realization, Ethan understood that the path he had taken was no longer defined by isolated decisions, but by a sequence of choices that had gradually transformed a small restructuring effort into something capable of standing on a much larger stage than anyone, including himself at the beginning, had ever anticipated. The morning of the final decision arrived with a calmness that felt almost unreal to Ethan Walker, as if the entire journey that had led him here had compressed into a single quiet moment inside a glass conference room overlooking downtown Boston. Outside, the city moved as it always did, but inside the room, the atmosphere carried a sense of finality shaped by months of preparation, review, and evaluation. Daniel Reed sat beside him as representatives from institutional advisory groups, legal teams, and financial regulators joined the final session to confirm whether the company would officially proceed toward public market entry. The lead coordinator opened the meeting by stating that all structural, financial, and compliance requirements had been successfully met under current regulatory standards, and that the company was now eligible to move forward into the formal public offering process. Ethan listened without interruption. As each section of the final report was reviewed, including long-term valuation stability, risk modeling consistency, and investor readiness projections. When it came time for him to speak, he was asked to summarize the core principle behind the financial system he had designed. Ethan explained that the entire structure was built around maintaining accuracy under uncertainty, ensuring that no part of the model depended on unrealistic assumptions or short-term distortions. He emphasized that the goal had never been rapid expansion, but sustained clarity under changing conditions, allowing the company to remain stable even when external variables shifted beyond control. The room remained silent for a moment after he finished, not out of hesitation, but because the explanation had distilled months of complex development into a simple but complete framework that everyone present could understand. After several final confirmations, the lead advisor formally stated that the company was approved to proceed into the public offering phase, pending final scheduling and market coordination. The announcement did not create noise or celebration in the room, but instead a collective acknowledgement that a significant threshold had been crossed. Daniel turned slightly toward Ethan as the meeting concluded and said that what had begun as a small internal restructuring effort had now evolved into a fully recognized public market candidate, with institutional interest already positioned for participation. Ethan did not respond immediately, as the weight of the moment settled quietly rather than dramatically. In the days that followed, the company entered a controlled transition phase where internal systems were gradually aligned with external regulatory expectations. Ethan worked closely with advisors to finalize documentation that would define how the company was presented to public investors, ensuring that every projection, model, and financial statement reflected the same structural integrity he had maintained from the beginning. Despite the increased pressure, his approach remained consistent, focused on precision rather than speculation and on stability rather than acceleration. One afternoon, Daniel informed him that multiple institutional groups had already indicated strong interest in participating once the public offering was officially launched, based on the consistency of the company's financial structure and its ability to demonstrate predictable performance under variable conditions. Ethan acknowledged the information quietly, understanding that the system he had built was now being evaluated not only as an internal solution, but as a market-ready framework with real external impact. Later that evening, as he walked alone through the familiar streets of Boston, the experience felt different not because the city had changed, but because his understanding of it had. The same streets that once represented uncertainty and isolation now felt connected to something far larger, as if every step he had taken since graduation had been building toward a structure that now extended beyond his original expectations. In that quiet realization, Ethan understood that the moment he had once experienced outside the graduation hall, when everything ahead of him had been uncertain and unsupported, had not been an ending at all, but the starting point of a path that had gradually transformed into something far greater than anything he had been told to expect.